Okay. Hi, guys. There we go.
I'm here. How's it going?
Hey.
Good. You can see me okay?
Yeah.
Great. All
Okay.
right.
Awesome. All right. I'm glad I got that figured out. All right. Welcome to our live, guys. My name's Catherine. If you follow me, welcome here. If you don't follow me, welcome as well. So I'm joined by Jessie from ROC United. And so Jessie and I are going to um, obviously talk about wage theft, and we're going to talk about our personal experiences with wage theft, our red flags. So, what are some sort of like warning signs for danger? And then, what sort of action can you take if you're seeing some of these red flags or if you're experiencing wage theft yourself? So, hence the title of the live: Red Flags, Gut Checks, and Missing Paychecks. So,
It's quite a title, I know.
um, and so, yeah. So I guess I'll introduce myself first, and then Jessie, if you'd like to introduce yourself as well, and then we can, jump in. So if you're new here, again, my name's Catherine, and I worked for a restaurant called Bernie's, and that was in Philadelphia, which is where I live. And I was a server there. And while I worked there, I experienced wage theft. And sort of as a result of, my employer not wanting to pay me, I ended up blasting him here on TikTok. And I got about 60,000 views on that one. On my video within about like 48 hours, and got paid, so got the bag. But obviously, like, shouldn't have had to blast my employer on TikTok in order to get paid. So and but after this whole thing happened to me, I found out, that wage theft is so rampant in the restaurant industry. And I was fortunate that I'd never experienced that ever before, but I've sort of made it my goal to educate myself more on wage theft, and talk about that more here on TikTok and educate others. And Jessie experienced wage theft and is now an organizer and all of that. So, Jessie, if you want to jump in and talk a little bit about your experience.
Yeah. Well, how's it going, everybody? I'm Jessie. I was a bartender for 15 years before I became an organizer with ROC. Long time. Um, yeah, so I experienced two wage theft cases myself. One in my home state back in 2012, Georgia, and then recently just won $6,000 in a wage case in California. So I moved out to Los Angeles and found that that was still an issue. So, I really became passionate about organizing, helping other people towards, cooperative efforts. What is within the best interest of themselves, their workspace, their communities. you know, and it just became such a regular thing for us to go out after these shifts and talk about it, you know, blow up some steam and complain. But I really was like, you know, listen, where are we pivoting to solutions? And organizing really turned me onto that. So really grateful to be here. Thanks for having me. Yeah, so excited to get started.
Yeah, thank you, Jessie, for joining me here on this live. I think it's really important to offer multiple perspectives. You know, not just like what do I think about wage theft versus what do you think about wage theft, but as we both know, wage theft can look like so different,
Yeah,
and specific cases of wage theft are very different. So I think it's also really important to showcase what some of those different ways that wage theft can occur, like what they look like, you know?
yeah,
So, um, thank you again to everyone who's tuning in. As we've all been talking, well, as we've been mentioning, we're going to talk about wage theft. So, just as a reminder, if you're new here, you know, wage theft is when your employer like basically steals from you, right? And that can look in a variety of different ways. My specific instance was that, you know, my paycheck didn't show up on payday, and a week later, after I had been on my own personal strike, it still failed to show up, and then you know, didn't show up again,
mm,
and prior to that it had been late. So all of those are, you know, are wage theft. And so um, feel free to ask your questions, whether that's about wage theft, whether that's about red flags, whether that's about how to organize, like kind of anything within the realm. Throw it in the chat. We also have some folks from ROC here on the chat as well. So, you know, if we don't get to your question out loud here on the live, someone in the chat may, you know, feel the need to answer it in the chat. So yeah, ask away. And thank you again for coming. So yeah, wage theft occurs anytime an employer doesn't pay you everything that you're owed by law. So that can be, you know, again, my instance where my paycheck just didn't show up or it was late. It can also be asking you to work off the clock. So my employer, I didn't experience this specifically at my restaurant, but my employer owns multiple locations, and I've talked to other workers who worked for him in the past or at other locations, and this is something common that he will do, is ask you to come in and work off the clock. So he'll do these deep clean days where it's mandatory for everybody to come in, and he'll say like, don't clock in. Or another form of wage theft is like not paying you the right hourly rate. So if you're like a server or you make the tipped hourly wage, he'll say come in for deep clean days, but like clock in as at that tipped hourly rate, which federally is 213, but in PA where I am is 283. But you're not doing tipped work. Like you don't have customers coming in tipping you. You're there to deep clean the restaurant, which is fine, but like they have to pay you minimum wage to do that. They can't be paying you $2.13 an hour unless you're collecting tips. That could be like illegal tip outs. So like the manager is not allowed to take a cut of the tips, you know, unless that manager is like doing tipped work. Like, so let's say you have someone who's a manager, but the bartender calls out, they go in and they work as a bartender, right? And someone else is there managing the place. Well, they're not there working as a manager, they're working as a bartender. So like it can get a little complicated, but all of those are different, you know, ways in which you're
mm-hmm.
employed from you.
Yeah. And you had mentioned earlier just how pervasive this issue is, right? And like, I love a good number, but just to give folks an idea, like last year alone, restaurant workers the Department of Labor had basically ordered $27 million to go back into the pockets of workers, right? Seems like a pretty large, decent, you know, amount of money, but really it was only about 3,500 cases filed. And this is a big part of why we wanted to come onto this live, is to really help people understand like the process a little bit about, you know, the fact that we had gone through it, our experiences, and that it is worth the time. You know, it is worth the time to pursue or just at least think about. And we want to unpack a little bit about those things in this live and some of the small things people can be thinking about, especially if there's red flags in the workplace, right? And
Right.
For me, my wage theft case in Georgia was a bit different than yours. For me, it was a misclassification. So, you know, um, got hired at this place. It's a mom and pop. Pop sits me down. He's like, "Look, I need you to sign this piece of paper. It's an independent contractor. It means you work for yourself. That's it. Your tips are your tips." And look, before this, I had never even gotten a paycheck in my life from a restaurant. It was always cash. 213 in Georgia. So, I was, being so young at the time, I really didn't have, I think, the knowledge. It just wasn't the space that I was in. I was more worried about being 21 or whatever it was.
Right.
And, when tax season came around, I was like, wait a minute, where's my W-2? And that's
Yeah.
when things, again, this was the gut check moment, right? Where I was like, wait a minute. And there was definitely other red flags ahead of that. But for me, that was, the big key issue was that it took so many federal protections off the table for me, like minimum wage, overtime, access to workers' comp, unemployment benefits. Those are big things to take away from me, right? Or anybody, any vulnerable worker that's working hard, expecting and showing up to a place, and you should be paid, right? So, that's why for me, it was just so worth it to look into the complaint process. What was it going to take and
Mhm.
assess the risk. So it's an important thing to think about.
Yeah, for sure. So do we want to jump into like what some of those red flags and yellow flags are?
Let's do it.
Yeah, so we've sort of compiled a list, and if you have thoughts or you have questions, like again, feel free to throw them in the chat. This is just based on our experience, and so we came up with a list, and then we sort of graded them, if you will, yellow flags versus red flags. And this doesn't mean that you will definitely, experience wage theft, but it's like danger signs, right? And I know someone asked a question in the chat earlier, and so just before we move on from like what wage theft is and all of that, George said, what if they have you doing a lot of side work, like hours of it each day? So if you're not, again, if you're not doing tipped work, you have to be paid minimum wage. So like if you just need to roll 5 things of silverware at the end of the day, like whatever, but if they want you to stay 2 hours extra after your shift,
Hmm.
clock out from the, you know, as your at your tipped rate, and then clock back in at that hourly like minimum wage rate. Sometimes it's like training or whatever they like categorize it as. It's like clear every time you clock in, like are you clocking in as a server, or are you clocking in at that, minimum wage, whatever that is in your state.
Hmm.
7.25, but every state has a different minimum wage.
Yep. And there is really good information about this on the Department of Labor's website that tackles, side work duties, and what workers should realistically be doing in that time, right? And I think the rule that they're talking about is 80-20, and people shouldn't be exceeding 30 minutes of side work during their shift under like being a tipped worker, right? And that's where employers can get in trouble is they're paying them tip credit, but they're having them stay for an extra hour and a half to scrub, the floors, or in some places I'm hearing about fixing plumbing, which is ridiculous, and not within our pay description at all, just job description, period. But yeah, that's an important thing to think about. That's a wage and hour issue. So if folks have also further questions, they can visit Department of Labor, or they can also hit us up. That's what ROC United is all about. So we appreciate the question.
Um, all right. So moving into, the bulk of the content for this live, which is our yellow and red flags.
Hmm.
Uh, so here are some just sort of gut check moments, like things to just like note in your sort of brain, right? Like uh,
Hmm.
some of these don't necessarily mean like up and quit or up and leave, or that it's necessarily something like seriously going on, but it's like worth sort of like observing, noting, keeping in mind, and continuing to pay attention, right?
Yeah.
um, that's sort of where we're going in terms of like our yellow flags. So